The Sign Spinner, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. When I was 16, I got work spinning a sign for a barber shop. I was hired through a go-between agency which, to my surprise, thoroughly trained its employees in the methods of cardboard advertisement spinning. During my training, my guru told me what I think was a moralizing tale, but I am not sure whether that exactly describes it. This is the story he told me. There was a young man with little to recommend him to the professional world. He had had great difficulty in school, though apparently through no fault of his own, but rather through unfortunate circumstance and a natural unfitness for the schooling in which he was raised. He had nonetheless a ready disposition to learn, and great zeal. His character, in fact, made his utter failure in school and first jobs the sadder to behold, because he threw himself into these pursuits with great trust and hope. However disheartening his defeats were to those friendly to him, he gave no impression of disappointment or despair, and so, when he came to this middleman agency looking for work, it seemed as though he had never had a job, and he took to his lessons with joyous naivety. So it seemed to my guru. Whatever his former failures had been, he proved exceptionally dexterous with large sheets of cardboard. His handling was deft at the first touch. He spun for car washes, barber shops, and the regular comers in search of sidewalk sign slingers. If you would believe my guru, his work was beautiful, and reached the sublimity to which the opera of the great masters of any craft attain. Drivers would honk their approval. Children would smile and laugh. Traffic routes changed, so my guru says, so that people might catch a glimpse of this young man spinning signs. His work was not compelling simply because he had mastered all of the possible moves and routines, which of course he had, or because he had introduced a great number of wondrous innovations, which he had, but because, in addition to this, his zeal and enjoyment were so completely communicated in his spinning. Something about his touch, to use my guru's word, but I admit that the whole thing remains somewhat mysterious to me. This young man, in the course of a year, found himself spinning for a bank at the northwest corner of the intersection of 64th and Washington, making more than any other spinner anywhere, many times over. But this gig ended tragically. After Alexander the Great had taken the Persian capital and remained there with his men for 4 months, sitting on the rich throne of Darius, he decided to set the palace on fire. What would cause a man to destroy the richest spoils of his efforts? The desire to avenge Athens? Drunkenness? Hopes of crushing the Persian spirit? A combination of these? Those are the explanations historians give. I would be content to accept the fact as though it were an already tired maxim. If a man gains Persepolis, he will have set the palace on fire within 4 months. It sounds like the sulky dictum that each man kills the thing he loves, or a platitude about fortune's wheel on which a man is almost certain to fall if he has been raised up high. Our young man had been raised up high, but I still do not know whether what came next was a fall. Now, with years having passed since I first heard this story, I can still say nothing more intelligent than that it must be either that he really fell and undid himself, or else that he was raised upward and out, like some mystic of board flinging. The first step in this drama was a fender bender during rush hour traffic on a Friday afternoon. A young woman, inspired by the sign spinner, had very foolishly decided to film him while driving by. In so doing, she did not attend to the car in front of her, which had stopped, and drove into it. No one was hurt, but the young woman did begin to rebuke the man in the car she had hit for ruining her clip of the spinner with his sloppy driving. In this woman's defense, the sign spinner's work had achieved such a compelling quality that it might rightly have earned him the title thaumaturge. Indeed, some of the superstitious in the area had become suspicious of him, and the crowds of homeless and children who would stand or sit wherever there was room, for no other reason than to watch the young man perform. The young woman's collision was followed by another like it not long after, and then another, and then still more, until the intersection, once most known for the weird rapture inspired by the man with the advertising board, became better known as a hazard and likely source of delay in one's commute. The frequent accidents drew the law's attention to the sign spinner, who was proved many times to be acting within the limitations set on such forms of advertisement. And then an online publication took notice of the phenomenon. I found the most popular articles about the sign spinner to see how they compared with my guru's telling. If I were to judge the author by the things he wrote, he must have been disingenuous and proud. I felt a sneer behind every sentence, although I couldn't say precisely in all cases what gave me this impression. And even when he did make me laugh, it was never without some uneasiness, as though he might somehow suddenly turn from his subject and lay my own folly bare to everyone. He seemed greatly pleasured by describing in the most prosaic way the sign spinner and the accidents apparently caused by his spinning. There was no hint that there might be anything close to beauty in what the spinner did. He would, in this way, show up as ridiculous those who had any love of the young man spinning his sign. At other times, he would write in an overwrought mode. He most ironically dubbed the sign spinner the siren of 64th and Washington. I have always been suspicious of popular criticism, whether it makes its home in literature, large societal concerns, politics, religion, or board flinging, because of its potential to list into parasitism. It was the case with this writer that his own stature and popularity grew in proportion to the fervor excited by the sign spinner. But he was nourished at his topic's expense, and he had reached the point at which a locust must fly on, or a farmer must leave the land fallow. The bank had borne much of the real animosity that came from the affair. The community, who loved the sign spinner, was reluctant to find fault in him, and so placed it on the bank. The writer played that strange game some persons do, in which they are, at times, so mocking that one doubts whether they think right and good mean anything at all, but at other times so earnestly intent on the utter destruction of the unjust that they seem to think of nothing other than right and good. The bank came off very poorly in the critics' pieces, and eventually the sign spinner was fired. I found the public apology they issued. It was put together with great rhetorical sensitivity and delicacy, for they needed somehow to satisfy the contradictory desires of the people. They did not want to be seen as causing traffic accidents by pushing their name, nor as the reason for the removal of the beloved sign spinner. In the end, the statement did not help them, and that branch of the bank closed within a year of dismissing the sign spinner. The sign spinner, despite his being let go, had continued to spin on 64th and Washington. Having been disallowed to spin for the bank, he procured a blank sign and took himself to the southwest corner of the intersection, inadvertently reminding all who passed what the bank had done. And it was then, after the bank had been dealt a mortal blow and the sign spinner had taken himself across the street, that the writer went for the first time to see the sign spinner. All the time before this he had, presumably, written only from the police reports made available to him and the eyewitness accounts of those who had seen the sign spinner in traffic accidents. Prompted by I do not know what, he went to see the sign spinner. If he had gone to suck whatever dregs he could find at 64th and Washington, he achieved his end as little as Paul did on his way to Damascus. I have seen it more than once, that a very clever and ironical person can be much like a mollusk, which is an admixture of extreme hardness and softness, and which, prima facie, is the hardest of the animals, but under closer investigation has most of its substance in what could be mistaken for the mucose discharge of another animal. It can happen with such a person, as I think it did happen with this writer, that something that is simple and good in a way he had not thought possible, can suddenly deprive him of his hardness, and he is left nude and entirely soft, and he has nothing to cover himself in this softness, because all that he has relied on to make himself durable has been taken away and proved not really to belong to him. I might have blushed had I heard him deliver his last piece about the sign spinner, Not that it was wrong or indecent, but it was somewhat overflowing, and as though he had discovered of himself and disclosed things that he might rather have found and reflected upon in the solitude of his room. He recanted his former articles, and even his former life, to the degree that a man can do so in such a context. He wrote in strange, contradictory phrases about the young man and his spinning, abundant emptiness and rich poverty, and many other such things. My guru concluded his telling of the tale without ceremony, saying that the spinner had disappeared from 64th and Washington not long after, nor had he come back to the Middleman Agency for another gig, which he certainly would have been given, because even when he had taken up the blank sign, some had begun to ask which company had a blank arrow as its logo, and to which of the buildings they should follow the spinner's sign. And that is the end of the story of the sign spinner. My guru did not guess about what had happened to the young man. I was somewhat irritated, and wanted to demand of him that he give me at least some speculation to close such a bizarre, unbelievable story, which apparently tended nowhere. But I at first believed that he could not give me what I wanted in closing, even if he had been willing to, so I did not ask. I later became suspicious of my guru, and thought he had told me a ridiculous story to mock me for my credulity. It was then that I looked for articles to verify what he had said. These made things worse, even the final article eulogizing the goodness of the sign spinner. The story was too full of contradiction and negation. Thwarted goodwill, excellence that undoes itself, signs that signify nothing, arrows that point nowhere. In this all there was the distressing thought that every path had been removed from the spinner, as even the enjoyment of a rather humble gift had been taken from him. I thought that disappeared might as well have been died. I was disheartened for a long time, and I could not readily forget the story as each day's work continually called it to mind. I eventually became so irritable and short with my younger siblings that my father took me aside, and when he could not discover the source of this change in me, he earnestly entreated me to make an examination of conscience. I obeyed and later returned to my father to promise to do better in the small things expected of me in the family. I followed through on this, but I was irritated still. I awoke one morning sometime after this agitated period, from a particularly good sleep, and it seemed as though all my worry about the strange story had been calmed for me in a single night. I awoke with a thought that if your view of the end is darkened, the ways leading to and from it may look the same, and the way up may look like the way down. I do not understand the story, but please do not blame me for telling it to you anyway. In truth, the story charmed me when I heard it, although I could not master it. I tell it because I believe there is something good in it, and even though my agitation about it still returns at times, as I tell it, its goodness is before me as it was when I was in the midst of my guru telling it to me, and I listened like a child.